The noon sun hung merciless over Cedar Ridge, casting harsh shadows that offered no relief from the August heat of 1883. Dust devils danced across the main street, stirring up grit that settled on everything: the weathered storefronts, the hitching posts, and the faces of the townspeople who had gathered in the square like vultures drawn to carrion. The church bell tolled. But this was no call to worship. Its bronze voice carried a different message today, summoning the citizens to witness what Sheriff Markham called frontier justice. The sound echoed off the mountains that surrounded their small mining town, bouncing back with a hollow finality that made even the boldest among them shift uncomfortably. Abigail Maris walked between two deputies, her hands bound with rough hemp rope that had already begun to chafe her wrists raw. Her auburn hair, usually pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, had come loose during her arrest, falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. The simple blue calico dress she wore, the same one she'd been mending when they came for her, was now torn at the sleeve and stained with dust from the jail cell floor. She kept her chin raised, though her legs trembled with each step. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea. But unlike that biblical miracle, this separation was born of hatred, not divine intervention. As she passed, the whispers began. There she is, the traitor. Benedict Arnold in petticoats. Should have known better than to trust a woman without family. Old Mrs. Henley, who ran the boarding house and had never liked anyone younger or prettier than herself, leaned forward with venom in her watery blue eyes. You've got blood on your hands. Abigail Maris, she hissed, then turned her head and released a thick stream of tobacco juice that splattered just inches from Abigail's worn boots. The gesture was a signal. Others followed suit. Tom Bradley, the bank clerk who'd always been too shy to speak to her before, now found courage in the mob's righteousness. He worked up saliva in his mouth and let it fly, the disgusting projectile landing on her shoulder. Sarah Mackenzie, the preacher's wife who preached Christian forgiveness every Sunday, pursed her lips and added her own contribution to the degradation. With each step, the humiliation compounded. The crowd closed in behind her, their voices rising like a choir of condemnation. They accused her of betraying the location of the silver convoy to the Dalton gang, resulting in the deaths of 3 good men and the loss of nearly 2 months' worth of mining profits. The evidence, they claimed, was irrefutable. A letter in her handwriting found in the gang's abandoned camp. Abigail wanted to scream, to tell them the letter had been stolen from her room, that she'd never willingly harm anyone in this town despite how they'd treated her since she'd arrived as an orphaned stranger 3 years ago. But her throat felt lined with sand, and she knew that even if she could speak, they wouldn't listen. Their minds were made up, their need for someone to blame too strong to be swayed by truth. The square opened before them, dominated by the gnarled oak tree that had stood since before the town's founding. Its massive trunk bore the scars of frontier justice, rope burns in the bark where other accused souls had met their fate. A makeshift platform had been erected beneath its spreading branches, and upon it stood Judge Harrison, a man whose black robes seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Deputy Coleman pushed Abigail up the rough wooden steps, the planks creaking ominously under their combined weight. The crowd gathered closer, forming a tight circle around the platform. She could smell their sweat, their anger, their bloodlust disguised as righteousness, somewhere in the mob. She heard a child asking his mother what was happening, and the woman's sharp response to hush and watch. Judge Harrison raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant whistle of wind through the mountains. His voice, when it came, was grave and theatrical, designed to carry to every ear present. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge," he began, his words echoing off the surrounding buildings. "We gather today to address a grave betrayal that has cost our community dearly. The accused, Miss Abigail Maris, stands charged with providing aid and comfort to known outlaws, resulting in the ambush and robbery of our silver convoy, and the deaths of William Foster, James Creek, and young Timothy Walsh." A woman in the crowd sobbed. Timothy's mother. Abigail realized with a stab of pain. The boy had been barely 19. eager to prove himself worthy of riding guard duty. She'd sewn buttons on his new shirt just 2 weeks ago, her fingers working carefully to ensure they'd hold fast. Now he was dead, and they blamed her for it. The evidence against the accused is substantial, the judge continued, reaching into his coat to withdraw a folded piece of paper. This letter, written in her own hand, was discovered among the belongings of the notorious Dalton gang after their last raid. In it, she provides detailed information about the convoy's route and timing. He began to unfold the letter, and Abigail's heart clenched as she recognized her own handwriting. It was the letter she'd written to her cousin Martha back in Kansas, describing her daily routines, including her habit of watching the silver convoys depart each month from her window above the seamstress shop. She'd mentioned the dates, the routes, innocent observations meant to paint a picture of her new life for a worried relative. Someone had stolen that letter, altered it, used her own words to condemn her. Furthermore, Judge Harrison's voice boomed. Witness testimony places the accused in suspicious circumstances on multiple occasions prior to the robbery. This was true, but the circumstances had been innocent. She'd been gathering herbs for medicinal teas in the hills where the gang was later discovered to have camped. She'd been seen near the assay office, but only because she'd been delivering mended clothes to the clerk's wife. Every innocent action had been twisted into evidence of guilt. The crowd began to murmur again, their voices rising like a threatening storm. Someone shouted for her to confess. Others called for immediate punishment. The platform seemed to sway beneath her feet, though she knew it was her own fear making the world unstable. Judge Harrison raised the letter high above his head. Before I read this damning evidence aloud and pronounce sentence, does the accused have anything to say in her defense? Abigail opened her mouth, finally finding her voice. But before she could speak, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. People were turning, murmuring, stepping aside to make way for someone pushing through their ranks with determined force. Ethan Cole emerged from the mob like a force of nature. The blacksmith's apprentice was not a large man, but his shoulders were broad from years of working the forge, and his arms corded with muscle earned through honest labor. His dark hair was damp with sweat, and soot still stained his leather apron. He'd come directly from his work, abandoning his duties without explanation. The crowd recognized him but seemed puzzled by his presence. Ethan kept to himself mostly, speaking little and working much. He'd arrived in Cedar Ridge around the same time as Abigail, but unlike her, he'd quickly found acceptance through his skill and reliability. The town needed a blacksmith more than it needed another seamstress. He climbed the platform steps with deliberate slowness, each footfall echoing like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. When he reached the top, he turned to face the crowd, his gray eyes sweeping across the sea of faces with an expression that was both calm and somehow dangerous. "This proceeding is unlawful," he said, his voice carrying easily despite its quiet tone. "You cannot condemn a woman based on circumstantial evidence and mob sentiment." Judge Harrison's face darkened. "Mr. Cole, you have no standing in this matter. Step down immediately, or face charges of interfering with justice." Ethan didn't move. Instead, he turned toward Abigail, and for the first time since her arrest, she saw something other than hatred or suspicion in someone's eyes. There was recognition there, memory, and perhaps regret. They'd known each other before, not well, but enough that he'd sometimes nod when their paths crossed, enough that he'd once helped her carry heavy bolts of fabric from the wagon to her shop. "Actually, Your Honor," Ethan said, never taking his eyes off Abigail's face, "I do have standing in this matter." He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell the coal smoke and hot metal that always clung to his clothes. Close enough to see the small scar on his left temple where a piece of flying steel had once caught him. His calloused hands reached up to frame her face, and she felt the rough warmth of his palms against her cheeks. "Because this woman," he said, his voice growing stronger, carrying to every corner of the square, "is my wife." The crowd gasped as one, a sound like wind rushing through a canyon. But before anyone could voice their disbelief, before Judge Harrison could object, Before Abigail herself could protest this outrageous lie, Ethan Cole leaned forward and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss or a romantic one. It was a declaration of war, a challenge thrown down before the entire town. His lips were firm and warm against hers, and she tasted salt from her own tears that she hadn't realized she'd been shedding. The kiss lasted only seconds, but in those moments, the world transformed around them. The shouting crowd, the harsh judgment, the rope-scarred oak tree, all of it faded away until there was only this moment of unexpected salvation in the man who'd risked everything to claim her as his own. When he pulled back, his eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not love, not yet, but determination, and a promise that she wouldn't face this alone. The crowd erupted. Some people shouted accusations of fraud. Others demanded proof of the marriage. Judge Harrison banged his gavel against the platform's railing, trying to restore order. But through it all, Ethan remained steady, his hands still gentle on her face, his presence a shelter in the storm of fury that surrounded them. "You're lying," Sheriff Markham bellowed, pushing his way to the front of the crowd. "There's no record of any marriage." Ethan finally released Abigail's face, but remained close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. When he spoke, his voice was calm despite the chaos around them. "The marriage was performed in Deadwood 3 weeks ago. I have the certificate, signed and witnessed according to territorial law. This woman is under my protection, and any harm done to her is harm done to me." It was a masterful lie, delivered with such conviction that even Abigail almost believed it. She watched the faces in the crowd, saw doubt beginning to creep in alongside the anger. Marriage was sacred, even in this rough frontier town, and territorial law was clear about a husband's rights and responsibilities. Judge Harrison's face had gone purple with rage. Even if such a marriage exists, it doesn't absolve her of the crimes she's accused of committing. "Perhaps not," Ethan replied, "but it does grant her certain legal protections. As her husband, I demand a proper trial with legal representation, not this circus." He gestured toward the mob, and several people had the grace to look ashamed. Others remained defiant, but the unified fury was beginning to fracture. Doubt was a powerful thing, and once it took root, it grew quickly. "Mrs." Henley pushed forward, her face twisted with suspicion. "If you're truly married, where have you been living? Why hasn't anyone seen you together?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "My wife has been staying with Mrs. Patterson while I finished building our home. We intended to announce our marriage once we were properly settled." Another lie, smoothly delivered. Mrs. Patterson had died the previous winter, and her small house on the outskirts of town had stood empty since then. It was the perfect cover story, no one to contradict it, and it explained Abigail's continued presence in town without seeming strange. Judge Harrison was clearly struggling with this unexpected development. The law was the law, even in frontier towns, and a husband's claim on his wife was nearly absolute. But his desire for justice, or vengeance, warred with legal precedent. "I demand proof of this marriage," he finally declared. "If Mr. Cole can produce a valid marriage certificate within 7 days, then his wife will be granted a proper trial. If he cannot..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. Ethan nodded curtly. 7 days. Agreed. He turned to Abigail, offering her his arm with formal politeness. "Come, wife, let's go home." She took his arm with trembling fingers, hardly believing what had just happened. As they walked through the crowd, people stepped aside with obvious reluctance. Some still muttered curses and threats, but the immediate danger had passed. She was no longer a friendless woman facing a mob's justice. She was a married woman under her husband's protection. The walk through town felt endless. Every window seemed to hold watching eyes. Every shadow might conceal an enemy. But Ethan's steady presence beside her kept her upright, kept her moving forward even when her legs threatened to give out. As they reached the edge of town where the desert began to reclaim the land, Abigail finally found her voice. "Why?" she whispered, not daring to look at him. "Why would you risk everything for me?" Ethan was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy with something she couldn't quite identify. Regret, perhaps, or determination. "Because 3 years ago, I made a choice that I've regretted every day since. Today, I made a different choice." She didn't understand what he meant, but there was something in his voice that told her this was all he would say on the matter. For now, it was enough that he'd saved her life. Everything else could wait. As they walked toward an uncertain future, the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, the town of Cedar Ridge settled into an uneasy quiet, like a pot removed from heat, but still simmering with dangerous possibilities. The game had changed, but it was far from over. The morning after Ethan's shocking declaration brought no peace to Cedar Ridge. Word had spread like wildfire through the settlement during the night, carried from house to house by those who couldn't contain their outrage. By dawn, clusters of men gathered outside Hutchinson's General Store and the Silver Dollar Saloon, their voices low but their intentions clear. Ethan Cole had made fools of them all. They said no man would risk his neck for a woman he barely knew unless there was something more to the story. Some whispered that he was in league with the Dalton gang himself. Others suggested a more romantic conspiracy, that he'd been secretly courting the seamstress and couldn't bear to see her hanged for crimes of passion rather than treachery. Judge Harrison hadn't slept at all. He paced his quarters above the courthouse like a caged wolf. His black robes traded for a simple white nightshirt that made him look smaller, more human, but no less dangerous. The law was a double-edged sword in the territories. It could protect as easily as it could condemn, and Ethan Cole had wielded it with surprising skill. But Harrison had not reached his position by accepting defeat easily. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist that clung to the mountains, he sent Deputy Coleman to fetch the town's most prominent citizens. If the law demanded a proper trial, then by God, he'd give them one they'd never forget. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, Abigail sat on the front steps of Mrs. Patterson's abandoned house, watching Ethan work. He'd procured lumber from somewhere, she didn't ask how, and was methodically repairing the sagging porch with the same focused intensity he brought to his blacksmith work. Each nail driven home with precise blows, each board measured twice before cutting. The house itself was a modest affair, built of rough-hewn pine with a stone chimney and 2 small windows that looked out toward the distant mountains. Mrs. Patterson had lived here alone for 15 years after her husband died in a mining accident, keeping a small garden and taking in mending to survive. The old woman had been kind to Abigail when she first arrived in town, one of the few who offered friendship without judgment. Now that kindness had become their salvation, though Abigail wondered if it would prove temporary. "The marriage certificate," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "You spoke as if it truly existed." Ethan paused in his hammering, a nail held between his lips as he considered his words. When he spoke, his voice was muffled but clear enough. "I have a friend in Deadwood, a clerk who owes me a favor. The certificate will exist by the time Judge Harrison demands to see it." "That's forgery," Abigail said, though she couldn't summon any real outrage. Forgery was a minor sin compared to the injustice she'd nearly faced. "It's survival," Ethan replied, returning to his work. "Besides, we'll make it legal soon enough if we choose to." The casual way he said it made her stomach flutter with an emotion she couldn't name. They were strangers bound together by circumstance and desperation. Yet there was something about his steady presence that made her feel safer than she had in months. A dust cloud on the horizon announced visitors long before they arrived. Abigail retreated inside the house while Ethan continued his repairs, though she positioned herself near the window where she could see and hear everything that transpired. Sheriff Markham arrived first, flanked by both his deputies and 3 men Abigail recognized as members of the town council: banker Theodore Whitman, mine foreman Lucas Brennan, and merchant Samuel Hayes. Behind them rode Judge Harrison himself, his black robes flowing dramatically in the morning breeze. They reined in their horses 20 feet from the porch, forming a semicircle that spoke of authority and barely contained hostility. Ethan set down his hammer and straightened slowly, his gray eyes moving from face to face with the measured calm of a man assessing threats. "Gentlemen," he said simply, wiping his hands on a rag. "To what do I owe this honor?" Judge Harrison urged his horse forward a few steps, using the animal's height to look down at Ethan with obvious intent. "Mr. Cole, this charade has gone far enough. We know you're not married to that woman, and we demand you cease this deception immediately." "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Your Honor," Ethan replied. "My wife and I are simply trying to settle into our new home. Is there some law against house repairs?" Sheriff Markham's face darkened. "Don't play games with us. Cole, there's no record of any marriage in the territorial files, and we've sent word to Deadwood. If you've forged documents, that's a hanging offense all by itself." Ethan's expression didn't change, but Abigail noticed his hands stilling completely, a sign she was beginning to recognize as dangerous. "Sheriff, I believe you're confused about the law. Territorial records are often delayed, especially from remote locations. The absence of paperwork doesn't invalidate a lawful ceremony." Banker Whitman, a thin man with nervous habits, leaned forward in his saddle. "Even if such a marriage existed, which we doubt, it doesn't grant immunity from prosecution. A wife can still testify against her husband in cases involving murder and treason." "Perhaps," Ethan said, "but she cannot be compelled to do so, and any evidence obtained through coercion of a spouse is inadmissible in territorial court. I believe Judge Harrison is familiar with the precedent set in the Morrison case of 1878. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Abigail watched through the window as the men exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with Ethan's knowledge of legal precedent. He was supposed to be a simple blacksmith, not a scholar of territorial law. Mine Foreman Brennan, a gruff man with hands permanently stained black from coal dust, finally broke the quiet. "You're mighty well informed for a hammer swinger. Cole, makes a man wonder where you really came from." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. In frontier towns, a man's past was generally considered his own business, but suspicion could change that unwritten rule quickly. Ethan seemed to understand this, because his next words carried a steel edge that Abigail had never heard before. "My past is my own, Mr. Brennan, just as yours is yours. But if you're questioning my character, I'm happy to defend it in whatever manner you prefer." The challenge was unmistakable, and Brennan's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his hip before he caught himself. A gunfight would serve no one's interests, least of all his own. Ethan Cole might be quiet, but everyone in town knew he was quick with both hammer and trigger. Judge Harrison raised his hand, restoring a semblance of order. "Mr. Cole, you seem to be laboring under a misapprehension. This is not a negotiation. You have claimed to be married to a woman accused of serious crimes. If you cannot produce valid documentation of this marriage within the agreed-upon time frame, she will face trial. If you can produce such documentation but it proves to be fraudulent, you will face trial alongside her." "And if the documentation proves genuine?" Ethan asked. "Then your wife will receive a proper trial with all the protections afforded by territorial law." Harrison replied, "Though I suspect the outcome will be the same." "Because you've already decided her guilt," Ethan said quietly. "Because the evidence is overwhelming." Harrison snapped. "That letter was written in her hand. Cole, multiple witnesses place her in suspicious circumstances. The woman is guilty, and your misguided chivalry won't change that fact." Abigail felt tears burning behind her eyes. Not from sadness, but from rage. They spoke about her as if she were property to be disposed of, a problem to be solved rather than a human being with rights and feelings. She pressed her face closer to the window, memorizing each face, promising herself that if she survived this ordeal, she would remember who had stood with the mob and who had shown mercy. "You mentioned evidence," Ethan said. his tone conversational despite the tension crackling through the air. "I'd like to examine this letter you claim she wrote." Merchant Hayes laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You're not a lawyer. Cole, you have no standing to examine evidence. As her husband, I have every right to review any accusations made against my wife. Territorial law is quite clear on this point." Ethan paused, letting the words sink in. "Unless, of course, you're afraid the evidence won't stand up to scrutiny." It was a masterful provocation, challenging their certainty while appealing to their pride. Judge Harrison's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous crimson. "Very well," he said finally. "You may examine the letter, but you'll do so in my courthouse, under proper supervision, and with witnesses present." "Agreed," Ethan replied. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock sharp." Harrison gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "And Cole, if you're thinking of running, don't. I've posted men on all the roads leading out of town. Your wife's fate is sealed one way or another." The threat was clear, but Ethan merely nodded as if the judge had commented on the weather. "We have nowhere to run to, Your Honor. This is our home now." As the delegation prepared to leave, Sheriff Markham lingered behind the others. "You're making a mistake, Cole," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for Abigail to hear. "That woman brought death to this town. Whatever you think you owe her, it ain't worth your life. Every man has to decide what his life is worth." "Sheriff," Ethan replied, "I've made my choice." Markham shook his head and spurred his horse to catch up with the others. The dust cloud that marked their departure seemed to hang in the air longer than natural, as if the very earth was reluctant to let go of their hostility. When they were finally alone again, Abigail emerged from the house, her legs unsteady from the tension of the confrontation. Ethan had returned to his repairs, but she could see the tight line of his shoulders, the careful control he was exerting over his movements. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "You could have told them the truth, saved yourself." "What truth?" he asked without looking up. "That I lied to save a woman I barely know? That would only prove their point about my character." "You do barely know me," she pointed out. "Why risk everything for a stranger?" This time he did look up, and the expression in his gray eyes was complex, part regret, part determination, part something else she couldn't identify. "Because 3 years ago, I made a choice that cost lives. Good people died because I was a coward." He set down his hammer and faced her fully. "I won't make that mistake again." "What happened 3 years ago?" For a moment, she thought he might tell her. His mouth opened slightly, and she saw the war between revelation and secrecy playing out across his features. But then he shook his head and picked up his hammer again. "That's a story for another day. Right now, we need to focus on surviving the next 6 days." Abigail wanted to press him, but something in his posture warned her off. Instead, she asked, "What happens tomorrow? At the courthouse?" "I examine their evidence and try to find holes in their case." He drove another nail home with perhaps more force than necessary. "And pray that my friend in Deadwood is as skilled with a pen as he claims to be. And if he's not..." Ethan's hammer paused mid-swing. "Then we face whatever comes together. That's what married couples do, isn't it?" The words were spoken lightly, but they carried weight nonetheless. They were bound together now, for better or worse, by laws and lies and the desperate hope that tomorrow would bring salvation rather than destruction. As the afternoon wore on, they worked in companionable silence, Ethan repairing the house that would serve as their shelter, Abigail cleaning the dust and neglect from rooms that had stood empty too long. It felt strangely domestic, almost peaceful, despite the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. But as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, both of them knew that the real test was yet to come. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or disaster, and their fragile alliance would either strengthen into something real or shatter under the weight of impossible circumstances. The game of survival had entered its second round, and the stakes had never been higher. The house on the edge of Cedar Ridge sat like a lonely sentinel against the vast expanse of desert that stretched toward the mountains. In the 3 days since Judge Harrison's confrontation, it had become their refuge and their prison, a place where two strangers played the dangerous game of pretending to be husband and wife. Mrs. Patterson's abandoned home bore the scars of neglect. The roof leaked in 2 places, letting in thin streams of water when the afternoon thunderstorms rolled down from the peaks. The floorboards creaked with every step, and dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through windows clouded with grime. But Ethan worked with methodical determination to make it habitable, while Abigail watched him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness that neither of them acknowledged aloud. They had settled into an uneasy routine. Ethan slept on the front porch, wrapped in a blanket he'd brought from his quarters at the blacksmith shop. Abigail took the single bedroom, though she rarely slept well. The walls seemed thin as paper, and every night brought new sounds from the darkness: the howl of coyotes, the rustle of unknown creatures in the sagebrush, and sometimes the distant thunder of horses' hooves that might have been real or might have been her imagination. During the days, they worked in careful coordination, like two dancers who knew the steps but had never rehearsed together. Ethan repaired what he could with salvaged materials and tools borrowed from his employer. Abigail cleaned with the fierce determination of a woman trying to scrub away more than just dirt and neglect. She found purpose in the small tasks: mending curtains, organizing the meager supplies they'd accumulated, coaxing life back into Mrs. Patterson's herb garden behind the house. They spoke little, but their conversations, when they came, were loaded with unspoken meaning. "The coffee's getting low," Abigail mentioned on the 3rd morning, stirring the grounds in the battered tin pot that served as their only luxury. "I'll get more when I go to town tomorrow," Ethan replied, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "For the courthouse appointment. Will you?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Will you be able to produce what Judge Harrison expects?" Ethan's hands stilled on the leather straps. "The document will be there. Whether it satisfies him is another matter entirely." She wanted to ask more, about his friend in Deadwood, about the risks they were taking, about what would happen if their deception was discovered. But the set of his shoulders warned her away from such questions. Ethan Cole was a man who held his secrets close, and 3 days of shared meals and domestic routine had not been enough to unlock them. Their first visitor came on the 4th day, just as Abigail was hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between 2 fence posts. She looked up to see a familiar figure approaching on foot: Mary Catherine O'Brien, the Irish woman who ran the town's only restaurant. Mary Catherine was perhaps 40 years old, with graying red hair and hands permanently stained from years of cooking and cleaning. She'd always been kind to Abigail, though never quite friendly enough to be called a true ally. "Mrs. Cole," Mary Catherine called out, and Abigail felt a strange jolt at hearing the name spoken aloud. "Might I have a word?" Abigail glanced toward the house, where Ethan was working on the roof, but he made no move to come down. This was her test to face alone. "Of course," she replied, forcing warmth into her voice. "Would you like some coffee? It's fresh made." Mary Catherine's sharp blue eyes took in the domestic scene: the drying clothes, the repaired fence, the small vegetable patch that was already showing signs of careful tending. "That would be lovely. Thank you." They settled on the front steps, 2 women sharing coffee from chipped cups, while the man of the house worked above their heads. It was a tableau of normalcy that felt almost absurd given the circumstances. "It's a fine thing you've done here," Mary Catherine said, gesturing toward the improvements. Mrs. Patterson would be pleased to see her home cared for again. "Thank you. Ethan's very skilled with repairs." "Aye, that he is." Mary Catherine sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Though I confess I'm surprised by this marriage of yours. Ethan always struck me as a man who kept his own counsel." There was no accusation in her tone, but Abigail felt the probing nature of the comment nonetheless. "Sometimes the strongest waters run the deepest," she replied. borrowing a phrase she'd heard her grandmother use. Indeed they do. Mary Catherine set down her cup and fixed Abigail with a direct stare. I won't pretend I haven't heard the talk in town. Folks are saying this marriage is mighty convenient, appearing just when you needed protection. Abigail's hands tightened on her own cup, but she kept her voice steady. People will always find something to talk about. Ethan and I chose to keep our courtship private. And the letter? The one they say proves your guilt. This was dangerous ground. Abigail had rehearsed this conversation in her mind, but facing it in reality was different. I wrote many letters to my cousin in Kansas, describing my life here. Someone stole one of them and altered it to make me appear guilty. I pray the truth will come out at trial. Mary Catherine studied her for a long moment, and Abigail had the uncomfortable feeling of being weighed and measured. Finally, the older woman nodded slowly. I've watched you these past 3 years, child. Watched how you treated folks who weren't always kind to you in return. Watched how you mended clothes for Mrs. Walsh's boy Timothy without taking payment, knowing she could barely afford food. Her voice softened. I don't believe you'd hurt anyone deliberately, and I'm not the only one who feels that way. Relief flooded through Abigail so suddenly that she felt dizzy. Thank you, she whispered. You can't know what that means to me. I can guess. Mary Catherine stood, brushing dust from her practical brown skirt. There are others in town who have doubts about this whole business. Judge Harrison and his cronies make a lot of noise, but they don't speak for everyone. As she prepared to leave, Mary Catherine paused and looked up toward the roof where Ethan continued his work. You've got yourself a good man there, child. Whatever brought you together, don't let pride or fear drive you apart. The frontier's hard enough without facing it alone. After Mary Catherine left, Abigail sat on the steps for a long time, thinking about her words. When Ethan finally climbed down from the roof, wiping sweat and tar from his hands, she was still there. Friend of yours? He asked, settling beside her with a cautious distance between them. I hope so. She seems to believe our story. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, Not everyone will. We should be prepared for visitors who come with less friendly intentions. As if summoned by his words, another figure appeared on the horizon. This time it was a rider, coming fast and raising a plume of dust that could be seen from miles away. Ethan tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol he now wore openly on his hip. The rider proved to be young Johnny Summers, the telegraph operator's son, barely 16 and trying to grow his first mustache. He pulled up his lathered horse and dismounted with the awkward energy of youth. Mr. Cole, ma'am, he called out, obviously excited to be playing messenger. Judge Harrison sent me to tell you, the marriage certificate from Deadwood came in on the afternoon telegraph. He wants to see you both at the courthouse first thing tomorrow morning. Abigail felt her heart skip a beat. Tomorrow would determine their fate. Either Ethan's mysterious friend had come through with a convincing forgery, or their deception would be exposed before the entire town. Tell the judge we'll be there, Ethan replied calmly, though Abigail noticed the slight tension in his jaw. After Johnny rode away, they stood in silence, both contemplating the implications of the message. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or disaster, and there was nothing left to do but wait. Are you afraid? Abigail asked quietly. Ethan considered the question seriously before answering. Fear is a luxury I can't afford right now. But am I concerned about tomorrow? Yes. What will happen if the certificate isn't convincing? Then we'll face whatever comes next together, he said simply. That's what we agreed to. But as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, both of them knew that their fragile alliance was about to face its greatest test. The charade that had protected them for nearly a week would either prove strong enough to withstand official scrutiny, or it would crumble and leave them both facing the consequences of their desperate gamble. Their fifth visitor came just before darkness fell completely. This time it was Sheriff Markham himself, accompanied by Deputy Coleman and a man Abigail didn't recognize, tall and lean with the weathered look of someone who spent his days in the saddle. Evening, Cole. the sheriff called out as they approached the house. "Mind if we have a word?" Ethan stepped out onto the porch, and Abigail noticed how his posture changed, becoming more alert, more dangerous. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "This here's Marshal Duncan from the Territorial Capital," Markham said, gesturing to the stranger. "He's got some questions about your marriage certificate." Marshal Duncan stepped forward, his pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Cole, I've been reviewing the documentation that arrived from Deadwood. While it appears to be properly executed, there are some irregularities that require clarification." Abigail's mouth went dry. Irregularities could mean anything. A detail that didn't match official records. A signature that seemed suspicious. Any of a dozen small mistakes that could unravel their entire deception. "What sort of irregularities?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "The officiating minister's name. For one thing, Reverend Joshua Matthews. I've sent inquiries to Deadwood, but so far, no one seems to know of any preacher by that name." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it could only have been seconds. Abigail held her breath, waiting for Ethan to respond, praying that he had an answer that would satisfy the marshal's suspicions. "Reverend Matthews was a traveling preacher," Ethan said finally. "He was only in Deadwood for a few days, performing marriages and baptisms for folks who couldn't wait for the regular circuit rider. It's not uncommon in the territories." Marshal Duncan nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. "Perhaps not, but it does make verification difficult." He paused, studying both of them with the careful attention of a man who made his living reading people. "I'll be staying in town until this matter is resolved. Mr. Cole, I suggest you and your wife be prepared to answer more questions tomorrow." After the lawmen left, Ethan and Abigail stood on the porch in the gathering darkness, both of them acutely aware that their time was running out. The net was closing around them, and tomorrow would determine whether they escaped or were caught in the web of their own deception. "Reverend Joshua Matthews," Abigail said quietly. "Does he exist?" "He did," Ethan replied. "He died of consumption 2 years ago in Denver. No family, no permanent congregation. The perfect ghost to perform a marriage that never happened." The calculating nature of his response chilled her. How long had he been planning this deception? And what other secrets was he hiding behind those gray eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing? As they prepared for what might be their last night of freedom, Abigail found herself wondering if she'd traded one kind of danger for another. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight brought only questions and the growing certainty that Ethan Cole was far more than the simple blacksmith he appeared to be. The game they'd been playing was nearly over, and she could only pray that when the final cards were revealed, they would still be on the same side. The courthouse hearing had gone better than either of them had dared hope. Ethan's mysterious friend in Deadwood had indeed proven masterful with a pen. The marriage certificate bore all the proper seals and signatures, aged just enough to appear authentic. Even Marshal Duncan's sharp eyes had found no obvious flaws, though his suspicion remained palpable. Judge Harrison had been forced to declare the document legally valid, granting Abigail the protections of a married woman while the investigation continued. But their temporary victory felt hollow as they walked back to the house in the late afternoon heat. The certificate had bought them time. Nothing more. The real evidence against Abigail, the letter in her handwriting, the witness testimonies, the circumstantial web that painted her as a traitor, remained unchanged. And now they faced another night of uncertainty, another day closer to a trial that could still end in disaster. The tension between them had been building since the courthouse, a pressure that seemed to thicken the very air they breathed. They'd maintained their roles perfectly in public, the devoted husband protecting his wife, the grateful woman standing by her man's side, but privately. The questions multiplied like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Abigail had watched Ethan during the hearing, noting the way he'd handled himself with quiet authority, his knowledge of legal procedure far beyond what any blacksmith should possess. He'd questioned witnesses with the skill of an experienced attorney, challenged evidence with the confidence of someone familiar with courtroom tactics. Who was this man who'd claimed her as his wife? And what secrets lay behind those gray eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing? They ate their evening meal in silence, beans and hardtack supplemented by vegetables from Mrs. Patterson's struggling garden. The simple fare tasted like sawdust in Abigail's mouth, her stomach too knotted with tension to appreciate food. Ethan ate methodically, as he did everything else, but she noticed his attention frequently drifting to the windows, watching for movement in the gathering dusk. After the dishes were cleaned and put away, they sat on the front porch as had become their custom. The desert air was beginning to cool, bringing relief from the day's heat and carrying the distant scent of sage and mountain pine. In other circumstances, it might have been peaceful. Tonight, it felt like the calm before a storm. 3 years ago, Abigail said suddenly, breaking the silence that stretched between them like a taut wire. You mentioned something that happened 3 years ago, something that cost lives. Ethan's hand stilled on the piece of leather he'd been working, a bridle that needed mending, another small repair in their ongoing effort to make the house livable. He didn't look at her, but she saw the tension creep into his shoulders. Some things are better left buried, he said quietly. Not when they affect the present. Abigail turned to face him fully, studying his profile in the dim light. You know things about me. Ethan, you know I was accused of betraying the Silver Convoy, that 3 good men died because someone used my letter to help the outlaws. But I know nothing about you except that you're willing to risk everything to save a woman you claim to barely know. Maybe that's enough. No, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. It's not enough. Not anymore. We're bound together now, for better or worse, and I have the right to know who I'm bound to. Ethan set down the bridle and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the star-scattered sky above them. For a long moment, she thought he would retreat into silence again. Then, almost inaudibly, he began to speak. 3 years ago, I wasn't a blacksmith. I was a deputy marshal working for the territorial government, assigned to track down the Dalton gang. We'd been chasing them for months, following a trail of robbery and murder across 3 territories. Abigail felt her breath catch. A deputy marshal. That explained his knowledge of legal procedure, his comfort with authority, his skill with weapons, but it raised even more questions. What happened? She asked softly. We finally cornered them in a canyon about 20 miles north of here. The gang had taken hostages, a family of settlers whose wagon they'd attacked, a man, his wife, and their 2 children. His voice became distant, mechanical, as if he were reciting facts from an official report. The children couldn't have been more than 8 and 10 years old. The pain in his voice was raw, immediate. Despite the years that had passed, Abigail found herself leaning forward, drawn into his story despite its obvious darkness. My partner wanted to wait for reinforcements, but I convinced him we couldn't risk it. The Daltons were getting desperate, and desperate men do terrible things to hostages. I thought we could take them quietly, save the family before anyone else got hurt. But something went wrong, Abigail said, though it wasn't really a question. Everything went wrong. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, and she could see the memories playing out behind his eyes. They spotted us before we could get into position. Shooting started, and in the chaos, he stopped, swallowing hard. The father tried to protect his family. He grabbed one of the outlaws' guns, tried to fight back. They shot him down like a dog. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and regret. Abigail waited, sensing there was more to the story, worse details that he was struggling to voice. The woman started screaming, begging them not to hurt her children, and his voice broke slightly. I ran. I heard the gunshots, heard her screaming, and I ran like a coward. Left my partner to face 6 armed outlaws alone. Oh, Ethan, Abigail whispered, her heart breaking for the pain she heard in his voice. By the time I found the courage to go back, it was over. My partner was dead. The family was dead. The Daltons had escaped with whatever money the settlers had been carrying. He turned to look at her then, and she saw the raw anguish in his eyes. 5 people died because I was too much of a coward to do my job. The pieces were falling into place now. His knowledge of the law, his guilt-driven determination to protect her, his willingness to risk everything for a stranger. He was trying to atone for a moment of weakness that had haunted him for 3 years. "That's why you left the Marshal Service," she said. "I didn't leave. I was dismissed in disgrace. Conduct unbecoming. They called it failure to uphold the duties of office. They were too polite to use the word coward, but everyone knew what it meant. And you came here to hide." "I came here to disappear," he corrected. "Ethan Cole, the failed lawman, died in that canyon. I became Ethan Cole, the blacksmith. Nobody special, nobody important. I thought if I kept my head down, worked hard, stayed quiet, maybe I could forget what I'd done. But you couldn't forget. No." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. "Every night, I heard that woman screaming. Every day, I saw those children's faces. And when I watched them drag you through town, when I saw that mob ready to tear you apart for crimes you didn't commit, I knew I couldn't run again." Abigail felt tears burning behind her eyes. But they weren't tears of pity. They were tears of understanding, of recognition. She knew something about guilt and shame, about being blamed for tragedies beyond your control. "The letter they found," she said slowly. "The one that supposedly proves my guilt. I wrote it to my cousin Martha in Kansas. I was lonely, Ethan, so terribly lonely in this place where nobody wanted me. I wrote about everything, my daily routines, the silver convoys I watched from my window, the people I met, innocent observations from a woman trying to connect with the only family she had left. Someone stole it," Ethan said. "Used your own words to condemn you. But who and why? I kept to myself, didn't have enemies. At least, I didn't think I did." It was a question that had tormented her since her arrest. Who in Cedar Ridge hated her enough to frame her for murder? Who had access to her private correspondence? The list of possibilities was disturbingly short. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house handled the mail. Ethan mused. "She's the most likely to have had access to your letters. But she's been nothing but kind to me. A little nosy, perhaps, but not malicious. People aren't always what they seem," Ethan said darkly. "In my experience, the kindest faces sometimes hide the blackest hearts." They sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The night air had grown cold, carrying the scent of approaching rain from the mountains. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice echoing off the canyon walls with a loneliness that matched their own. "The morning they arrested me," Abigail said suddenly, "I was mending a shirt for Thomas Crawford's boy. Little Jeremy had torn it climbing trees, and his mother didn't have time to fix it herself." She smiled sadly at the memory. "Such a small thing, but it felt important. It felt like I was finally becoming part of the community. And then they came for you. Sheriff Markham and his deputies. They searched my room, found nothing, but somehow that letter turned up in the Dalton gang's camp anyway. Evidence that I was their accomplice, their source of information about the silver shipments." "The timing was convenient," Ethan observed. "The letter appearing just when they needed someone to blame for the robbery. You think it was planted? I think someone wanted you gone from this town, and they didn't much care how it happened." The possibility chilled her more than the mountain air. To think that someone she'd trusted, someone she'd tried to befriend, had orchestrated her downfall with such calculated malice was almost worse than random bad luck. "Why would anyone want to hurt me? I'm nobody special, just a seamstress trying to make an honest living." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words were carefully measured. Sometimes being nobody special is reason enough. Some people can't stand to see others find happiness, even small happiness. They'll destroy it just because they can. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with such cruelty, But Abigail didn't press him. They'd shared enough painful memories for one night. "What happens now?" she asked. "The certificate bought us time, but it didn't clear my name. They still think I'm guilty. Now we find the real truth," Ethan said with quiet determination. "Someone in this town knows more than they're saying. Someone has answers we need. And if we can't find them—" He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her cold skin. It was the first time he'd touched her since that desperate kiss in the town square, and the simple contact sent unexpected warmth through her entire body. "Then we face whatever comes together," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken before. "I won't run again, Abigail. Not from the truth, not from danger, and not from whatever this is between us." The simple honesty in his voice broke down the last of her defenses. Here was a man who'd made terrible mistakes, who'd failed when others needed him most, but who was trying to be better, trying to atone for past cowardice with present courage. "I believe you," she whispered. "And Ethan? What happened 3 years ago? That wasn't cowardice. That was human fear in an impossible situation. The real coward would have never gone back at all." He squeezed her hand gently, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something other than pain in his eyes. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of forgiveness, starting with himself. They stayed like that as the night deepened around them, two wounded souls finding solace in shared honesty and the fragile beginning of trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but tonight, for the first time in 3 years for him and 3 days for her, neither of them felt completely alone. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying promises and threats in equal measure. Change was coming to Cedar Ridge, and to the two people who'd found each other in its shadows. Whether that change would bring salvation or destruction remained to be seen, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. 2 weeks had passed since the courthouse hearing, and an uneasy peace had settled over their small corner of the world. The marriage certificate had withstood scrutiny, though Marshal Duncan remained in town, watching them with the patience of a hawk circling its prey. Abigail had begun to hope that perhaps the worst was behind them, that they might actually survive this elaborate charade they'd constructed. She should have known better. In the territories, peace was always temporary, and danger had a way of finding those who thought themselves safe. The morning started like any other. Ethan had ridden into town before dawn to work at the blacksmith shop, maintaining the pretense of normal life while earning the money they desperately needed for supplies. Abigail spent her time tending the garden and working on mending projects that provided a small but steady income. The domestic routine had become almost comfortable, a rhythm of shared purpose that felt surprisingly natural. She was hanging laundry on the line when she first noticed the rider approaching from the north. At this distance, it was just a dark speck against the pale morning sky. But something about the way horse and rider moved sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't the casual pace of a traveler or the purposeful stride of someone with business in town. This was the urgent gallop of someone with bad intentions. Abigail shaded her eyes with her hand, trying to make out more details. The rider was still too far away to identify, but her instincts, honed by years of living alone in an often hostile environment, screamed danger. She abandoned the laundry and hurried inside, moving to the window where she could watch while remaining hidden. As the rider drew closer, she could see it was a man on a powerful bay horse, pushing the animal hard across the desert terrain. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle, and there was something about his posture that spoke of violence held barely in check when he was perhaps a quarter-mile away. Abigail caught sight of his face beneath the wide brim of his hat, and her blood turned to ice water in her veins. She knew that face, had seen it in her nightmares for 3 years. Silas Dorn, the sole survivor of the Dalton gang's final robbery, the one man who'd escaped when the rest were gunned down by a rival gang in a dispute over stolen gold. Silas had been the cruelest of the Daltons, a man who took pleasure in others' pain and never forgot a slight. He'd been wounded in that final shootout, shot through the shoulder and left for dead in the desert. Everyone assumed he'd died of his wounds, but apparently everyone had been wrong. Now he was here, in Cedar Ridge, and there could be only one reason for his presence. Somehow, he'd learned about the accusations against her, about the letter that supposedly proved her complicity in the gang's activities. He'd come to claim his supposed accomplice, or perhaps to silence the woman who could potentially identify him as one of the killers. Abigail's mind raced as she watched him approach. She was alone, defenseless, with Ethan miles away in town. Even if she could somehow get word to him, he'd never arrive in time to help. She had perhaps 10 minutes before Silas reached the house, and no good options for escape. The rifle. Ethan kept a Winchester repeater above the fireplace, loaded and ready for exactly this kind of emergency. Abigail had never fired a gun in her life, but desperation had a way of making cowards brave. She grabbed the weapon with trembling hands, checking to make sure it was indeed loaded before positioning herself at the front window. Silas pulled up his lathered horse 20 yards from the house, close enough that she could see the cruel smile splitting his weathered face. He'd aged hard in the 3 years since she'd last seen him. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and a jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Probably a souvenir from that final gunfight, but his pale blue eyes held the same cold malice she remembered. Well, he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. If it ain't little Abby Maris, the seamstress turned outlaw. Heard you've been having some trouble with the law lately. Abigail kept the rifle trained on him through the window, though she wasn't sure she could actually pull the trigger if it came to that. I don't know what you want, Silas, but you're not welcome here. Right away, and we'll call it even. Silas laughed, a sound like gravel grinding together. Call it even? Sweetheart, we ain't even close to even. You see, I've been following the stories about Cedar Ridge's little trader, and I found them mighty interesting. Seems someone's been using your name to take credit for my work. I never worked with you or your gang. That letter was stolen and altered. Oh, I know that, Silas said, swinging down from his horse with casual ease. Question is, does anyone else? Seems to me you're in a powerful lot of trouble, and that makes you valuable to old Silas. He began walking toward the house with slow, deliberate steps, and Abigail fought the urge to retreat deeper into the building. Running would only delay the inevitable, and at least here she had the advantage of cover and a clear field of fire. Stay back, she warned, though her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. I'm armed, and I'll use this rifle if I have to. Will you now? Silas paused, apparently considering this threat with amusement. Tell me, Abby, you ever kill a man before? Ever looked into someone's eyes as the life leaked out of them? It ain't as easy as folks make it sound. Maybe not, but I'm willing to learn. Brave words from a scared woman. He resumed his approach, and Abigail could see the confidence in his movements. He'd faced down armed opponents before and survived. One frightened seamstress with a rifle she barely knew how to use wasn't much of a threat in his estimation. Here's what's going to happen. Silas continued conversationally. You're going to put down that rifle and come with me. We're going to take a little ride up into the mountains where we can have a proper conversation about your situation. And if I refuse, then I'll take you anyway, but you'll be unconscious for the trip. Your choice, but I'd recommend staying awake. The trail gets mighty rough in places. Abigail knew she was trapped. Even if she managed to wound Silas with a lucky shot, he was too close to the house. He'd be on her before she could work the rifle's action for a second shot. But she also knew that going with him meant certain death, probably after considerable suffering. Silas Dorn wasn't known for quick, merciful endings. What do you really want? She asked, stalling for time while her mind raced for alternatives. Information, Silas replied. See, I've been wondering who really set up that silver convoy job. Wasn't me. I was 200 miles away robbing banks at the time, but someone with detailed knowledge fed the information to whoever did pull it off. Someone who knew the route, the timing, the guard positions. And you think I know who that was. I think you know more than you're letting on. Maybe you really are innocent like you claim. But innocent folks sometimes see things, hear things, remember details that might not seem important at the time. He was only 10 yards away now, close enough that Abigail could see the old bullet scar on his shoulder and the newer marks that spoke of a hard life lived on the wrong side of the law. In another few steps, he'd be close enough to rush the house before she could stop him. "Last chance. Abby, come quiet, or—" The crack of a rifle shot echoed across the desert, and Silas staggered. Grabbing his left arm where blood was already beginning to seep through his shirt, he spun toward the sound, drawing his pistol with practiced speed. But there was nowhere to take cover in the open ground around the house. "Drop the gun! Silas!" Ethan's voice carried from somewhere behind a low ridge about 50 yards to the east. Abigail couldn't see him, but she could hear the deadly calm in his tone. Somehow, he'd spotted the danger and circled around to get a clear shot. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas said, though he made no move to drop his weapon. "If it ain't Deputy Marshal Ethan Cole, back from the dead. Heard you turned coward after that business with the hostages." "Maybe I did," Ethan replied. "But I'm here now, and you're bleeding. Want to test whether I've gotten my nerve back?" Silas was in an impossible position. He couldn't see Ethan's exact location, couldn't charge the house with a sniper covering it, and couldn't retreat to his horse without exposing his back to rifle fire. But Abigail knew he was too proud and too mean to surrender without a fight. "Tell you what, Marshal," Silas called out, "how about we make this interesting? I'll trade you the woman for safe passage out of here. Seems like a fair deal." "Counteroffer," Ethan said. "You drop the gun and ride away, and I let you live. That's the only deal you're getting. But then I don't get to finish my conversation with little Abby here. We were just getting to the interesting part." Silas suddenly broke into a run, not toward his horse as Abigail expected, but directly toward the house. It was a desperate gamble. If he could reach the building, he might be able to use her as a hostage to force a standoff. The move caught everyone by surprise, including Ethan, whose second shot went wide as his target zigzagged across the uneven ground. But Abigail had been ready for something like this. As Silas reached the front porch and lunged toward the door, she stepped back from the window and pulled the trigger. The Winchester's recoil nearly knocked her off her feet, and the sound was deafening in the confined space. But her shot found its mark. Silas stumbled and fell, clutching his right leg where the bullet had shattered his kneecap. "Son of a—" Silas bit off the curse, rolling behind the dubious cover of Mrs. Patterson's old rocking chair. He still had his pistol, and wounded animals were always the most dangerous. Ethan appeared at the corner of the house, moving with the fluid grace of a man trained in combat. He had his rifle trained on Silas's position, but the outlaw was partially concealed behind the porch furniture. "It's over, Silas," Ethan said. "Drop the gun, and maybe you'll live long enough to see a doctor. You always were too soft." "Cole," Silas snarled. "That's why you couldn't save those hostages. That's why you'll fail again." He raised his pistol, aiming not at Ethan but at the window where Abigail stood. It was a final, spiteful gesture. If he was going to die, he'd take someone with him. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Abigail stepped clear of the window, and Ethan's rifle spoke once more. The shot took Silas in the center of his chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the porch floor. His pistol discharged harmlessly into the air before clattering away across the wooden planks. For a moment, the desert was silent except for the ringing in their ears from the gunshots. Then Ethan was moving, approaching the fallen outlaw with careful steps, his rifle still ready in case of tricks. But there would be no more tricks from Silas Dorn. The man who'd terrorized the territories for years lay still, his pale blue eyes staring sightlessly at the morning sky. Abigail emerged from the house on unsteady legs, the Winchester clutched in her hands like a lifeline. She'd never seen death up close before, never been responsible for causing it, and the reality was both more and less than she'd expected. Silas looked smaller in death, less threatening. Just a broken man who'd chosen the wrong path and paid the ultimate price. "Are you hurt?" Ethan asked, his eyes searching her for signs of injury. "No, I'm fine." But even as she said it, she could feel the reaction setting in. The trembling that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. The nausea that rose in her throat as the adrenaline began to fade. Ethan reached her just as her legs gave out, catching her before she could fall and holding her steady while the shock worked its way through her system. She leaned against his solid warmth, grateful beyond words that he'd arrived when he did. "How did you know?" she asked when she could trust her voice again. "I saw him from town, recognized the horse. Silas always favored that bay mare." Ethan's voice was grim. "I cut across the hills to get here faster. You saved my life. We saved each other." He corrected. "That was good shooting, Abigail. You didn't hesitate when it mattered." She looked at the rifle in her hands, surprised to find that she felt no regret about using it. Silas had come here to hurt her, probably to kill her, and she'd defended herself. It was that simple, even if the emotional aftermath would take time to process. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we report this to Sheriff Markham and hope he believes our story." Ethan glanced at Silas's body. "With any luck, this might actually help clear your name. Dead outlaws can't contradict testimony about their activities." As they stood together in the aftermath of violence, Abigail realized that something fundamental had changed between them. They'd faced mortal danger together, protected each other, proven that their partnership was more than just a convenient fiction. Whatever else might happen, they were truly allies now, bound together by shared peril and mutual trust. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky, burning away the morning chill and promising another scorching day. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Abigail felt something approaching hope. They'd survived Silas Dorn, and if they could survive him, maybe they could survive anything the frontier threw at them. The game had changed again, but this time, perhaps the change was in their favor. The bullet from Silas Dorn's pistol had found its mark after all, though not where he'd intended. In those chaotic final moments of the gunfight, as Ethan had rushed to check on Abigail's safety, a wild shot had torn through his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the porch steps. At first, the adrenaline had masked the pain, but as Sheriff Markham and his deputies arrived to investigate the shooting, Ethan's face had grown pale as winter snow. "Just a scratch," he'd insisted, even as blood seeped through his shirt and his left arm hung useless at his side. But Abigail had seen enough frontier injuries to know better. The bullet had gone clean through, which was fortunate, but it had damaged muscle and possibly nicked bone. Without proper care, infection could set in. An infection in the territories was often a death sentence. Dr. Marcus Henley, no relation to the boarding house matron despite sharing her surname, had done what he could at the scene. A gruff man in his 60s with hands that shook slightly from too many years of frontier medicine and cheap whiskey. He'd cleaned the wound and applied a crude bandage, but his examination had been brief, conducted under the watchful eyes of Sheriff Markham and Marshal Duncan, both of whom seemed more interested in Silas Dorn's corpse than Ethan's welfare. "Shoulders torn up pretty good, Doctor," Henley had muttered, wrapping the wound with practiced efficiency. "Keep it clean, keep it still, and pray it don't fester. That's about all I can do without proper facilities." Now, 3 days later, Abigail had taken over his care completely. She'd transformed Mrs. Patterson's small bedroom into a makeshift hospital ward, moving Ethan from the porch where he'd been sleeping to the more comfortable bed inside. He'd protested weakly, claiming it wasn't proper for unmarried people to share such close quarters. But she'd reminded him tartly that they were supposed to be husband and wife. Besides, propriety seemed less important than keeping him alive. The fever had started on the second night, a low, persistent burn that made his skin hot to the touch and brought troubled dreams filled with the ghosts of his past. Abigail had learned to recognize the signs, the way his breathing would become shallow and rapid, how his good hand would clench and unclench as he fought battles that existed only in his memory. The soft words he'd murmur in his delirium, apologies to people long dead, confessions of guilt that broke her heart to hear. She'd barely left his side, surviving on catnaps in the wooden chair beside the bed and meals of whatever simple fare she could prepare with one eye always on her patient. Mary Catherine O'Brien had stopped by twice with fresh bread and soup, her Irish practicality proving invaluable as she helped change bandages and offered advice on fever management. But mostly, it was just Abigail and Ethan, locked together in a small room where life and death hung in the balance. "You should eat something," she said softly, holding a spoonful of broth to his lips. It was the 4th day, and the fever had finally broken during the night, leaving him weak but lucid. "You need to keep your strength up." Ethan accepted the broth reluctantly. His gray eyes focused on her face with an intensity that made her self-conscious. She knew she looked terrible. Her hair was loose and unkempt, her dress wrinkled from sleeping in the chair, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But his gaze held something warmer than mere gratitude. "You didn't have to do this," he said when she set the bowl aside. "Nurse a man you barely know back to health. You could have left me to Dr. Henley's questionable care and washed your hands of the whole business." "Where would I go?" Abigail asked, attempting lightness. "My reputation in this town isn't exactly sterling. Besides, married women are supposed to care for their husbands, aren't they? Is that what we are now? Married?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address. Their partnership had begun as a desperate deception, evolved into genuine friendship, and now seemed to be becoming something deeper. But what exactly that something was remained undefined. "I don't know," Abigail answered honestly. "What are we, Ethan?" He was quiet for a long moment, his good hand plucking at the quilt that covered him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "3 nights ago, when the fever was at its worst, I thought I was going to die, and all I could think about was how sorry I was that I'd never really talked to you, never told you about the things that matter, never asked about your dreams, your fears. What made you laugh before this town tried to break your spirit?" Abigail felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You were delirious. Fever makes people say things." "No," he interrupted gently. "I was more honest than I've been in years, maybe more honest than I've ever been." He turned his head to look at her directly. "I know why I claimed you as my wife that day in the square. It wasn't just about atoning for past failures or proving I wasn't a coward. It was because in that moment, watching you face that mob with such dignity and strength, I realized I couldn't bear to lose you." The simple confession hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent 4 days caring for this man, watching him fight pain and fever, seeing him at his most vulnerable. Somewhere in those long hours of tending wounds and monitoring breathing, her feelings had shifted from gratitude to something much more complex. "Ethan," she began, but he held up his good hand to stop her. "Let me finish, please." He struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "I need to tell you about the years before I came to Cedar Ridge, about the woman I thought I loved, and how I learned that love isn't always what it appears to be." Abigail settled back in her chair, sensing that this was another crucial revelation, another piece of the puzzle that was Ethan Cole. "Her name was Margaret Sinclair," he said, his voice taking on the distant quality it always held when he spoke of the past. "Beautiful, sophisticated, from a wealthy family in Denver. I met her during my last assignment as a marshal, when I was investigating a series of bank robberies that had the territorial government concerned. What happened? I fell hard and fast. Margaret was everything I thought I wanted, elegant, cultured, nothing like the rough frontier women I'd known. She seemed fascinated by my work, always asking questions about my cases, my methods, the people I was tracking." Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the windows. She could guess where this story was heading. "She was feeding information to the outlaws," she said quietly. "Worse than that, she was their leader." Ethan's laugh held no humor. Margaret Sinclair was really Maggie Saunders, wanted in 3 territories for robbery and murder. She'd been using me to stay one step ahead of the law, and I was too besotted to see it. "How did you find out?" The hard way. We were supposed to meet for dinner the night before the final raid on her gang's hideout. Instead, I found her with 2 of her men, counting the money from their latest robbery. Money from a bank job that had left 2 guards dead and a teller crippled for life. The pain in his voice was evident, and Abigail found herself reaching out to take his good hand in both of hers. He squeezed her fingers gratefully before continuing. She laughed when she saw me, actually laughed, said I'd been useful, but that she was tired of pretending to care about a simple country lawman. That's when I realized that everything I thought we had together was a lie. Every smile, every kiss, every declaration of love. All of it was just part of her plan. What did you do? What I should have done from the beginning. I arrested her. His voice hardened. It didn't stick. Her family's money bought the best lawyers, and they found ways to discredit the evidence. She walked free while good men stayed dead. And then came the hostage situation with the Dalton gang. 6 months later, by then, I was already questioning everything I thought I knew about people, about trust, about my own judgment. When the shooting started and I heard that woman screaming, all I could think about was Margaret's laughter. How easily I'd been fooled. How my weakness for a pretty face had already cost lives. So you ran? So I ran, he confirmed. And I've been running ever since, in one way or another, until you. Abigail felt tears pricking at her eyes. The man lying wounded in this bed had been betrayed by someone he trusted, had his faith in human nature shattered by calculated cruelty. Yet, somehow, he'd found the courage to risk everything for her. Why? She asked. After what Margaret did to you? Why trust another woman? Why put your life on the line for someone you barely knew? Ethan was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his words were soft but clear. Because when I watched you walk through that mob, when I saw how they treated you, I realized something important. You weren't Margaret. You weren't calculating or cruel or manipulative. You were just a frightened woman facing an impossible situation with more grace and dignity than I'd shown in my entire adult life. He turned to look at her again, and she saw something in his gray eyes that took her breath away. I claimed you as my wife to save your life, Abigail. But somewhere along the way, I started hoping it might become real. These past few days, watching you care for me, seeing your kindness and strength up close, I know it's selfish. And I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like the chance to court you properly, to see if what I think I feel is real, and if maybe you might feel something similar. The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over. Not tears of sadness, but of something much more complicated. Relief, perhaps, or recognition, because sitting in that small room, holding the hand of a wounded man who'd risked everything for her, Abigail realized that she'd already begun to care for Ethan Cole in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or necessity. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of you, but of this, of feeling something real in a place where I've felt nothing but loneliness for 3 years. What if it doesn't last? What if we're just 2 desperate people clinging to each other in a storm? Then we'll find out together, Ethan said simply. But Abigail, I need you to know something. Win or lose, live or die, I'm glad I stepped onto that platform. I'm glad I kissed you in front of the whole town. Whatever happens next, these past few weeks have been the most honest I've ever lived. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he was showing her, broke down the last of her defenses. She leaned forward and kissed him, gently because of his injuries, but with all the emotion she'd been holding back. It was different from that desperate first kiss in the town square. This one was a choice, a promise, a beginning rather than an ending. When they broke apart, both of them were crying, tears of relief, of hope, of the simple joy of 2 lonely people finding each other against impossible odds. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes, I'd like to be courted properly. I'd like to see what this becomes when we're not running for our lives. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of rain from the mountains, promising the kind of storm that would wash the world clean and leave everything fresh and new. Inside the small bedroom that had become their sanctuary, 2 wounded hearts began the slow process of healing together. building something real from the ashes of deception and desperation. The charade was over. What came next would be entirely up to them. The news of Silas Dorn's death spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire across dry prairie grass. By evening, everyone in town knew that the notorious outlaw had been killed in a gun battle at the Cole homestead, and that Abigail, the woman they'd been ready to hang as a traitor, had helped to bring him down. The story grew with each telling, as frontier stories often did, until some versions had her facing down 3 armed desperados single-handedly, while others painted Ethan as a returning hero who'd saved the town from certain doom. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than the stories. Sheriff Markham had arrived at the house within an hour of the shooting, bringing Dr. Henley and half the town council with him. They'd found Silas Dorn's body sprawled on the front porch, the shattered rocking chair testament to the violence that had taken place there. But more importantly, they'd found documents in Silas's saddlebags, letters and maps that revealed the true scope of his criminal activities, including detailed plans for robbing the silver convoy that had cost 3 good men their lives. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Markham had muttered, studying a hand-drawn map that showed the exact route of the ill-fated convoy. "This here proves Dorn was behind the robbery. Not Mrs. Cole." The admission had come reluctantly, but it had come nonetheless. The evidence was undeniable. Silas had been planning the convoy attack for months, working with accomplices whose names were carefully recorded in his own handwriting. Abigail's letter had been stolen and altered, just as she'd claimed, used to provide false evidence of her involvement while the real criminals escaped justice. Judge Harrison had been notably absent from the investigation, claiming urgent business in the territorial capital. But Marshal Duncan had examined the evidence thoroughly, his pale blue eyes taking in every detail with professional thoroughness. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of official vindication. "Mrs. Cole is hereby cleared of all charges related to the silver convoy robbery," he'd announced. "The territorial government recognizes that she was the victim of a deliberate conspiracy to conceal the true perpetrators of this crime." It should have been a moment of triumph, but Abigail had felt only exhaustion. 3 weeks of living under the threat of execution had taken their toll, and even vindication couldn't immediately erase the memory of that howling mob or the taste of fear that had become constant companion. Now, 5 days later, the effects of that vindication were beginning to ripple through the community in ways both subtle and profound. The first sign came from an unexpected source: Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, the same woman who'd handled Abigail's mail and had been under suspicion as the potential thief. She arrived at the Cole homestead on Thursday morning, carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread and wearing an expression of genuine contrition. "Mrs. Cole," she said, her usually confident voice wavering slightly. "I've come to apologize. I should have spoken up sooner, should have told folks what I knew about that letter of yours." Abigail, who'd been tending her garden in the cool morning air, straightened slowly. "What did you know, Mrs. Henderson?" "I saw who took it," the older woman admitted, her weathered hands twisting the handle of her basket. "From your room, the night before the robbery. I was coming back late from visiting my sister, and I saw someone climbing down from your window. Thought it was strange, but, well, I minded my own business. Figured it wasn't my place to interfere." "Who was it?" Abigail asked, though part of her wondered if she really wanted to know. "Harold Mackenzie," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "The bank clerk's boy. He's been sweet on you for months, following you around town like a lovesick puppy. I reckon he thought taking something personal of yours would be romantic somehow." The revelation hit Abigail like a physical blow. Harold Mackenzie was barely 19, a shy young man who'd never been able to manage more than a stammered greeting when their paths crossed. To think that his boyish infatuation had set in motion the chain of events that nearly cost her life was almost too much to process. "He gave the letter to someone else," she said, the pieces falling into place. Someone who saw its potential and altered it to frame me. That's my thinking. Mrs. Henderson agreed. Harold ain't smart enough or mean enough to plan something like this, but he's weak-willed, easily led. If someone convinced him he was helping you somehow, or threatened him with consequences. She didn't need to finish the thought. In a town like Cedar Ridge, a young man's reputation could be destroyed by whispers of impropriety. If someone had discovered Harold's theft and threatened to expose him unless he cooperated further, he might have been desperate enough to agree to anything. "Where is Harold now?" Abigail asked. "Gone." "Mrs." Henderson replied sadly. "Left town the day after Silas Dorn was killed. His parents say he's visiting relatives in California, but folks are starting to whisper that he might not be coming back. The coward's way out," Abigail thought bitterly. But perhaps it was for the best. If Harold had remained in Cedar Ridge, the truth of his involvement would have eventually come to light. And frontier justice could be harsh for those who betrayed their neighbors. Mrs. Henderson's visit was followed by others throughout the week. Mary Catherine O'Brien came by with fresh vegetables and an invitation to Sunday dinner at her restaurant. Tom Bradley, the bank clerk who'd been among those who'd spat at her during that terrible walk to the square, arrived with his hat in his hands and shame written across his face. "Mrs. Cole," he'd said, unable to meet her eyes. "I come to ask your forgiveness. What I did that day, joining that mob, letting my anger get the better of my Christian judgment, there ain't no excuse for it. We all make mistakes when we're afraid. Mr. Bradley," Abigail had replied, surprised by her own capacity for forgiveness. "The important thing is learning from them. You're more generous than I deserve," he'd said, finally looking up to meet her gaze. "If there's anything I can do to make amends, anything at all, you just have to ask." But the most significant visitor came on Saturday afternoon, as Abigail was hanging laundry and Ethan was working in the garden behind the house. A small delegation approached on foot. Reverend Samuel Morrison from the church, accompanied by his wife Martha and 3 of the town's most prominent matrons. Abigail watched them come with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, uncertain what this formal visit might bring. "Mrs. Cole," Reverend Morrison said, removing his hat as he approached. "Might we have a word? All of us together." They gathered on the front porch, the same spot where Silas Dorn had breathed his last just a week before. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Violence and death had given way to reconciliation and new beginnings. The eternal cycle of frontier life played out in miniature. "We've come to discuss tomorrow's church service," Martha Morrison said, her voice gentle but formal. "Given recent events, given the truth that's come to light about your innocence, we feel it's important for the community to acknowledge, the wrong that was done to you. We want to hold a special service," added Mrs. Patricia Whitman, the banker's wife. "A service of reconciliation and thanksgiving, to celebrate your vindication and to ask forgiveness for the way you were treated." Abigail felt a tightness in her throat. These were the same people who'd watched in silence as she was dragged through town, who'd done nothing to stop the mob's fury. Yet here they were, offering what amounted to a public apology, a chance for the community to heal from the divisions that had torn it apart. "That's very kind," she managed to say. "But is it what the community really wants? Or just what a few people think should happen?" "It's what's right," Reverend Morrison said firmly. "What happened to you was a violation of everything we claim to believe in. Justice, mercy, the presumption of innocence. If we're truly a Christian community, we need to make amends." Ethan appeared from around the side of the house, drawn by the sound of voices. His shirt was damp with sweat from garden work, and there was soil under his fingernails. But he carried himself with the quiet dignity that had first caught Abigail's attention all those weeks ago. "Ladies, Reverend," he said, nodding politely to each of them. "I hope you'll forgive the state I'm in. Saturday afternoon garden work doesn't allow for formal attire." "Think nothing of it. Mr. Cole," Martha Morrison replied with a warm smile. "We're the ones who should apologize for arriving unannounced. We were just discussing tomorrow's church service with your wife. The casual use of that word, wife, sent a small thrill through Abigail. Their marriage might have begun as a legal fiction, but it was becoming more real with each passing day. The shared trials, the growing affection, the simple domestic rhythms of life together, all of it was building something substantial from the foundation of desperate necessity. "What kind of service?" Ethan asked, settling beside Abigail on the porch steps. "A service of reconciliation." Reverend Morrison explained, "We want to acknowledge publicly that Mrs. Cole was wrongly accused, and that the community failed in its Christian duty to protect the innocent, and we want to celebrate your marriage properly," added Mrs. Whitman. It seems wrong that such a momentous occasion was overshadowed by all this trouble. Perhaps we could arrange a blessing ceremony, something to mark the beginning of your life together as husband and wife. Abigail felt Ethan's hand brush against hers, a subtle gesture of support and solidarity. They'd talked about making their marriage real, about moving beyond the legal fiction that had saved her life. But the idea of a public ceremony, of standing before the entire community and speaking vows they actually meant, felt both thrilling and terrifying. "We'd be honored," Ethan said, speaking for both of them. "If Abigail agrees, of course." All eyes turned to her, waiting for her response. These people had wronged her, had been ready to see her hang for crimes she didn't commit. But they were also her neighbors, the community she'd chosen to make her home. Forgiveness was a choice, and healing required courage from both the wounded and those who'd caused the wounds. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think that would be healing. For all of us." The service was held the following afternoon, in the small wooden church that sat on a rise overlooking the town. The building was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the porch. Word had spread beyond Cedar Ridge itself. Folks had come from neighboring settlements to witness what some were already calling the miracle of reconciliation. Abigail wore her best dress, a simple but elegant blue silk that had belonged to her mother. Ethan had borrowed a proper suit from the undertaker, the only man in town close to his size, and despite the garment's morbid associations, he looked handsome and dignified. They sat in the front pew, hands clasped together, as Reverend Morrison delivered a sermon about justice, mercy, and the importance of standing up for the innocent. "We gather today," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed church, "to acknowledge a great wrong that was done in our community. A woman was falsely accused, condemned without proper trial, subjected to treatment that violated every principle of Christian charity and frontier justice." A murmur ran through the congregation, a collective sound of shame and acknowledgement. "But we also gather to celebrate," the Reverend continued, "to celebrate the truth that emerged, the courage that was shown, and the love that conquered fear. Mr. and Mrs. Cole, would you please stand?" They rose together, facing the crowded church. Abigail could see faces she recognized. Mary Catherine O'Brien beaming with approval, Tom Bradley looking earnestly repentant, Mrs. Henderson dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. But she could also see strangers, people who'd come simply to witness this moment of community healing. "Ethan Cole," Reverend Morrison said solemnly, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Ethan replied, his voice clear and strong. "Abigail Maris Cole, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Then, by the power vested in me by God and the territory, and before this witness of this community, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Ethan kissed her then, there in front of the entire congregation, not the desperate, defiant kiss of that first day in the town square, but a gentle, loving kiss that spoke of commitment and hope for the future. The church erupted in applause, the sound washing over them like a benediction, as they walked down the aisle together afterward, hand in hand and truly married at last. Abigail marveled at how much had changed since that terrible morning when they dragged her through these same streets. The fear was gone, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: belonging. Outside the church, under the spreading branches of the old oak tree where they'd once planned to hang her, the community of Cedar Ridge celebrated the union of two people who'd found love in the midst of hatred, hope in the depths of despair. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by neighbors eager to make amends, and children ran laughing between the adults, their joy untainted by the darker memories that haunted their elders. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Abigail stood with her husband beside the tree that had once symbolized judgment and death. Now it seemed to represent something different: the possibility of redemption, the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful. They were truly married now, truly part of this community, truly home. And for the first time in years, the future looked bright with promise. 2 years had passed since that scorching August day when Ethan Cole kissed Abigail Maris in front of an angry mob, and the world had transformed around them in ways neither could have imagined. The small house on the edge of Cedar Ridge had grown into something resembling a proper homestead, with additional rooms built onto the original structure and a barn that housed a growing collection of horses and livestock. But the most remarkable change wasn't in the buildings or the land. It was in the purpose the place had found, the role it had come to play in the life of their community. The Open Hand Ranch, as they'd come to call it, bore a simple wooden sign at the entrance to their property. Burned into the weathered plank was the image of an outstretched hand, palm up, fingers open, a symbol of welcome that could be understood by anyone, regardless of language or literacy. Beneath it, in Ethan's careful script, were the words that had become their creed: haven for the lost, hope for the weary. It had started small, as most meaningful things do. 6 months after their church wedding, young Timothy Walsh, no relation to the boy who died in the convoy attack, had appeared at their door. 13 years old, orphaned when cholera swept through a settlement 50 miles north. He'd been wandering the territories for weeks, surviving on charity and stubbornness. Abigail had taken one look at his hollow cheeks and determined eyes and declared that he was staying for supper. One meal had become one night had become a week, and by winter, Timothy had his own bed in what had once been Mrs. Patterson's sewing room. "Boy's got good hands for horsework," Ethan had observed, watching Timothy gentle a half-wild Mustang with patience and intuitive understanding. Shame to waste talent like that. Timothy had proven to be the first of many. Word traveled fast in the territories. Word of a place where orphaned children and displaced families could find shelter, where questions about the past weren't asked and judgment wasn't passed. By the spring of 1885, the Open Hand Ranch was home to 8 children of various ages, from little Sarah McKenna, barely 5 years old and still mourning parents lost to a flash flood, to 16-year-old Marcus Washington, a freed slave son who'd been traveling west in search of opportunity and belonging. The children weren't the only ones who found their way to the ranch. Martha Clemens, a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, came seeking work and stayed to become the closest thing to a grandmother the children had ever known. She ran the household with gentle efficiency, teaching the girls domestic skills while ensuring the boys understood that cooking and cleaning weren't beneath their dignity. "A man who can't take care of himself is no good to anyone else," she'd declare. Watching 14-year-old Jacob Patterson, no relation to their late neighbor, struggle with the intricacies of bread making, "Your future wives will thank me for this education." Dutch Henriksen, a former cavalry soldier with one arm lost to a Confederate bullet and a heart too big for his gruff exterior, had arrived looking for work breaking horses and stayed to become the ranch foreman. He taught the children to ride, to care for animals, and most importantly, to respect the power and unpredictability of the frontier. "This land don't forgive mistakes," he'd tell them. his weathered face serious as he demonstrated proper knots or safe handling techniques. But it'll reward those who treat it with respect. The ranch supported itself through a combination of horse breeding, small-scale farming, and the modest income Ethan still earned from occasional blacksmith work in town. But their real success was measured in different terms, in the laughter that echoed across the yard each evening, in the pride on a child's face when they mastered a new skill, in the letters that arrived from former residents who'd moved on to build lives of their own. Young Timothy, now 15 and nearly as tall as Ethan, had shown such aptitude with horses that a rancher from Colorado had offered to take him on as an apprentice. The boy had been torn between excitement and loyalty until Abigail sat him down for a long conversation about dreams and opportunities. The purpose of a home, she'd told him, isn't to keep you forever. It's to prepare you for whatever comes next. Timothy had left in the spring, tearful but determined, promising to write and visit whenever possible. His first letter had arrived 3 weeks later, full of enthusiasm for his new life and gratitude for the foundation the ranch had given him. "You taught me that family isn't just blood," he'd written in his careful script. "Family is people who choose to love you and help you become who you're meant to be." The sentiment had brought tears to Abigail's eyes and confirmed what she'd come to understand about their unconventional household. They weren't just sheltering children, they were raising them, giving them the tools and confidence to face whatever challenges the world might offer. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had been in Ethan himself. The guilt-ridden former marshal who'd claimed her as his wife to atone for past failures had evolved into something approaching the man he'd always had the potential to become. He was still quiet, still thoughtful, but the crushing weight of self-doubt had lifted. Working with the children, teaching them skills and watching them grow, had given him a sense of purpose that police work never had. "You know what I've learned?" he'd said one evening as they sat on their expanded front porch, watching the children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway." "Is that what you did?" Abigail had asked. "That day in the town square?" "That day, I was terrified." He'd admitted, terrified of failing again, of making things worse, of watching someone else suffer because of my weakness, but I was more terrified of doing nothing. Their marriage had deepened and strengthened over the months, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. They'd learned each other's rhythms, discovered compatible dreams, and created something that was entirely their own. Ethan still sometimes woke from nightmares about the hostage situation, but Abigail's presence helped chase away the ghosts. She still occasionally felt the shadow of those terrible weeks when the town had turned against her. But Ethan's steady love had taught her that the past didn't have to define the future. They'd never had children of their own, whether by choice or circumstance. Neither felt the need to discuss, but the ranch was full of young voices and energy. Each child brought their own story, their own wounds to heal, their own dreams to nurture. Some stayed for months, others for years. But all of them left carrying a piece of what the Open Hand Ranch represented, the radical idea that everyone deserved a chance, that kindness was stronger than cruelty, that love could indeed conquer fear. On this particular evening in late September of 1885, Abigail stood on the front porch watching a scene that had become wonderfully familiar. Marcus Washington was teaching 8-year-old Emma Hartwell to rope fence posts, his patience evident as she struggled with the unfamiliar motions. Sarah McKenna was helping Martha Clemens hang laundry, standing on a wooden crate to reach the line and chattering about the kittens that had been born in the barn. Dutch Henriksen was working with the older boys to repair a section of corral fence damaged by the previous night's storm. It was a tableau of domestic tranquility that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago, when she'd been standing in the town square facing an angry mob. Yet here it was, not perfect, not without its challenges and heartaches, but real and solid and meaningful. Ethan emerged from the barn, leading a young mare he'd been training. At 28, he'd grown into his full strength, his shoulders broad from physical work, his hands skilled from years of practice. The shy blacksmith who'd claimed her as his wife had evolved into a man of quiet authority and deep compassion. "How's she coming along?" Abigail called out, gesturing toward the mare. "Ready for her new home," Ethan replied, patting the horse's neck with evident satisfaction. "The Hendersons will be pleased. She's got good manners and a gentle mouth." The sale of horses provided much of their income, but Ethan was selective about buyers. He insisted on meeting prospective owners, ensuring that his carefully trained animals would be treated with kindness and respect. More than once, he'd refused sales to men whose attitudes toward animals suggested they might be cruel masters. "A horse will give you everything it has," he'd explained to the children. "The least we can do is make sure they go to people who'll appreciate that gift." As the evening light faded into dusk, the children began their familiar routine of evening chores: feeding animals, securing gates, bringing in tools left scattered around the yard. It was a choreographed dance of responsibility and cooperation, each person knowing their role and taking pride in completing it well. Later, after supper had been eaten and dishes cleaned, after the youngest children had been tucked into bed and the older ones had settled into quiet activities, Abigail and Ethan walked hand in hand toward the small cemetery at the edge of their property. It held only 2 graves: Mrs. Patterson, whose remains they'd moved here from the town cemetery at Martha Clemens's suggestion, and Silas Dorn, whose body they'd claimed when no one else would. "Even the worst among us deserves proper burial," Ethan had said when she'd questioned the decision. "And sometimes remembering the cost of choosing the wrong path helps us appreciate the right one." They stood now between the 2 graves, reading the simple markers they'd erected. Mrs. Patterson's bore her name, dates, and the words, "Kindness lives on." Silas's was even simpler: Silas Dorn, 1843 to 1883, may he find peace. "Do you ever wonder," Abigail asked softly, "what might have happened if things had gone differently? If you hadn't stepped onto that platform? If the town had carried through with their plans?" "Sometimes," Ethan admitted. "But then I remember something my father used to say. What matters isn't the storms that come, but how we choose to weather them." He squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing across the simple gold band that had replaced the fictional marriage certificate as the symbol of their union. "We weathered the storm, Abigail. We came through it together, and we built something beautiful from what could have been a tragedy." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the quiet strength that had saved her life and continued to anchor their shared existence. In the distance, she could hear the soft sounds of their household settling for the night, children's voices calling good night to each other, Dutch Henriksen's deep laugh as he shared some story with the older boys, Martha Clemens humming an old hymn as she finished her evening tasks. "I love you," she said quietly, words that still carried the power to surprise her with their simple truth. "And I love you," he replied, turning to kiss her forehead. "Past, present, and whatever future we're brave enough to build together." As they walked back toward the house, passing the sign that welcomed all comers to the Open Hand Ranch, Abigail reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. They'd begun as strangers bound together by desperate circumstances, but they'd chosen to become something more, partners in the truest sense, builders of a place where the wounded could heal and the lost could find direction. The ranch would continue to grow and change. She knew. New children would arrive. Others would leave to pursue their dreams. Challenges would come. Drought, disease, the inevitable hardships of frontier life. But they would face whatever came with the same courage and determination that had brought them this far. Behind them, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled in the darkness, no longer a place of fear and suspicion, but a community that had learned from its mistakes and grown stronger in the breaking. Ahead lay the comfortable warmth of home, filled with the voices and dreams of those who'd found sanctuary beneath their roof. It was, Abigail thought as she climbed the familiar steps to their front porch, exactly the life she'd never dared to imagine. And it was theirs, built from love, sustained by hope, and open to all who needed a place where they could belong. The Open Hand Ranch stood as a beacon in the wilderness, proof that even in the harshest of environments, kindness could take root and flourish. And at its heart were two people who'd learned that the greatest courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to love in spite of it.